they tied her to a cross for stealing bread until the giant cowboy cut her free. Under the blazing sun, a starving girl stands bound before the whole town, punished for a single loaf. The church bell tolls, dust swirls in the street, and no one dares step forward until one man does. A towering cowboy, scarred by his past, slices the ropes and lifts her into his arms, defying the mayor, the deputy, and every whispering soul. But this girl is no simple thief. Hidden against her heart is a paper that could change the fate of the land, a secret deed worth more than gold, and the men who condemned her will do anything to bury it. As the fire spreads and gunsmoke darkens the horizon, one question hangs heavier than the storm clouds. Can a giant cowboy and a girl once tied to a cross stand against the town's greed and find freedom not just for themselves, but for everyone who thirsts for justice? Before we begin, drop a hello in the comments. Share your corner of the world and how you're feeling today. It's a beautiful thing to witness how stories can connect us across oceans, languages, and lives. The August sun hung merciless in the Colorado sky, beating down on the rail town's dusty square where a crowd had gathered. Deputy Crane's boots kicked up clouds of dirt as he dragged Isabel Ortega forward, her dark hair falling across her face. In his other hand, he gripped a loaf of bread like evidence of some grave crime. "Let all see what happens to thieves," Deputy Crane announced, his voice carrying across the square. Isabel stumbled but kept her chin high, even as tears threatened to spill from her eyes. Her younger brother Mateo pressed against a hitching post, his thin frame shaking with each cough. The fever that had gripped him for days showed in his flushed cheeks and glassy eyes. "Isabel," he called weakly, but no one paid him any mind. Mayor Granger stood on the wooden sidewalk, mopping his brow with a silk handkerchief. "Proceed with the punishment," he ordered, nodding to his men as they hauled forward a rough-hewn wooden cross. The townsfolk shifted uneasily as Deputy Crane bound Isabel's wrists to the crossbeam. Some women turned away, clutching their shawls closer despite the heat. Others muttered dark comments about half-breeds and savages, though Isabel's father had served honorably with the army. "Our Father?" Isabel whispered, her prayers barely audible above the wind that rustled through the square. "Who art in heaven?" The town bell began to toll, each deep note falling like a judgment. A cloud of dust rose from the north road, and the thunder of hoofbeats drew every eye. A massive black horse emerged from the haze, its rider even more imposing. Colt Brannan sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders and powerful frame casting a shadow longer than any man's should. Months on the cattle drive showed in his trail-worn clothes and the dust that coated his boots. The horse's iron shoes struck sparks from the stones as Brannan reined up hard. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, took in the scene. The muscles in his jaw clenched tight as he watched Isabel struggle against her bonds. Without a word, he swung down from the saddle. His spurs rang against the packed earth as he strode forward. The crowd parted before him like water around a boulder, whispers following in his wake. "That's Brannan," someone hissed. "The giant. The one who broke up that fight in Dodge City. Heard he carried a wounded man 20 miles. Deputy Crane's hand twitched toward his gun, but the look in Brannan's eyes froze him in place. The big cowboy reached to his belt and drew his hunting knife, the blade gleaming in the harsh sunlight. Mayor Granger stepped forward. "Now see here!" But Brannan paid him no mind. In 2 long strides, he reached Isabel. The knife flashed once, twice, and the ropes fell away. Isabel swayed, her legs weak from standing in the heat, but Brannan caught her before she could fall. His massive arms cradled her as gently as if she were made of spun glass. "You're safe now, miss," he murmured, his voice surprisingly soft for such a large man. He turned to where Mateo huddled against the post. "Come along, boy," he said with a gentle nod. The child scrambled to follow, hope replacing fear in his fever-bright eyes. The crowd stood frozen as Brannan carried Isabel away, her dark head resting against his shoulder. His boots left deep prints in the dust, and Mateo's smaller footsteps followed beside them. Not a single voice was raised to stop them. Only when they had disappeared down the side street did the spell break, The townsfolk began to disperse, avoiding each other's eyes. Deputy Crane kicked at the fallen ropes, his face dark with impotent rage. And Mayor Granger stood on his sidewalk, straightening his vest with trembling hands, knowing that something had shifted in his town, something that all his money and influence might not be able to control. The town bell tolled one final time, the sound echoing across the square where a wooden cross stood empty against the burning sky. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty street as Colt Brannan carried Isabel through the whispering crowd. His boots made heavy prints in the dirt, each step measured and purposeful. Behind them, Mateo hurried to keep pace, his thin shoulders shaking with each dusty cough. "Ain't right, taking in their kind," a voice muttered from the boardwalk. "That Brannan's asking for trouble," came another whisper. Colt paid them no mind, his weathered face set like stone as he headed toward the edge of town. Isabel's slight frame trembled in his arms, though whether from fear or exhaustion, he couldn't tell. Her dark eyes remained fixed ahead, holding on to what dignity remained after the morning's humiliation. The shack appeared ahead, squatting low beneath 3 old cottonwoods whose leaves rustled in the hot wind. It wasn't much, just a single room with rough-hewn walls that Colt had rented upon returning from the cattle drive, but it offered shelter, and right now, that was what mattered most. "Almost there," he murmured, feeling Isabel's quick breath against his shoulder. Mateo stumbled on the path, another coughing fit racking his small body. The dust from their walk had settled in his lungs, making each breath a struggle. Colt slowed his pace, making sure the boy kept up. Inside the shack, afternoon light filtered through the single window, illuminating the sparse furnishings, a narrow bed, a pot-bellied stove, and a rough table with 2 chairs. Colt gently laid Isabel on the bed, its rope springs creaking under even her slight weight. "Water," he said, reaching for a tin cup on the shelf. "You need to drink." Isabel's hands shook as she took the cup, but she managed a small sip. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice rough from the morning's ordeal. Colt moved to the stove, adding kindling and stoking the embers back to life. The familiar motions gave him time to think, to plan their next steps. Behind him, Mateo slumped in one of the chairs, his coughing finally subsiding. "Let me see your wrists," Colt said, turning back to Isabel. The rope had left angry marks on her skin, and her dress was torn at the shoulder. From a shelf, he retrieved a small tin of salve he kept for rope burns and saddle sores. His large hands seemed impossibly big next to her delicate wrists, but years of handling spooked horses had taught him gentleness. He applied the salve with careful touches, noting how Isabel flinched at first before gradually relaxing. "I had to take it," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The bread. Mateo hasn't eaten in 2 days. I tried to work, but no one would hire me." Tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't know what else to do." Colt straightened, his expression softening. Without a word, he moved to the stove, where a pot of yesterday's stew still sat. He stirred it back to life, adding water and more kindling to the fire. "Eat," he said simply, filling 2 bowls. "Both of you." Mateo's eyes grew wide at the sight of food. The boy fell upon the stew like a starving wolf, though his sister ate more slowly, as if savoring each spoonful. Colt watched them from his place by the stove, his heart heavy at their obvious hunger. It wasn't long before Mateo's head began to droop, his empty bowl nearly slipping from tired fingers. Colt caught it just in time, laying the boy down on his bedroll near the fire. Within moments, Mateo was asleep, his breathing finally easy and regular. Night fell quickly, as it often did in the high country. Colt lit a lamp, its yellow light casting soft shadows on the walls. He settled in his chair with his worn Bible, finding comfort in its familiar pages as he kept watch. A sudden gasp from the bed drew his attention. Isabel had woken, her eyes wide with fear, her hands clutching at empty air. "The cross," she whimpered. "Please, not again." "Peace," Colt said softly, turning to a familiar passage. "The Lord is my shepherd." He read, his deep voice gentle in the lamplight. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." Gradually, Isabel's breathing steadied. She sat up slowly, drawing her knees to her chest. After a moment's hesitation, she reached into her bodice and withdrew a carefully folded packet of papers. "There's something you should know," she said, her voice stronger now. "Why they really arrested me." Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the papers, revealing an official document with an army seal. Colt moved closer, holding the lamp up to better see. The deed was genuine. He recognized the official letterhead and the careful penmanship of army correspondents. It granted water rights to a spring just outside town, signed by a captain and witnessed by 2 officers. "My father," Isabel explained, touching the signature reverently. "Captain Miguel Ortega. He served with honor in the army, earned this land fairly. But when he tried to protect the spring from the cattle barons—" Her voice caught. "They shot him. Said it was an accident, but I know better." Colt studied the document again, understanding dawning in his eyes. A spring in this dry country was worth more than gold. No wonder the town's powerful men wanted Isabel gone. A young woman alone would be easier to drive away than a decorated army captain. "I never showed anyone," Isabel continued. "Kept it hidden, knowing they'd try to take it. But now—" She looked up at Colt, fear and determination warring in her expression. "Now I don't know what to do." Colt carefully refolded the deed, his mind working through the implications. The morning's arrest hadn't been about a loaf of bread at all. It had been about water, the lifeblood of the West, and the lengths some men would go to control it. Morning light crept through the cabin's wooden slats, painting thin golden lines across the rough floorboards. Isabel stirred on the bed, her face turned toward the window where dawn was breaking over the Colorado hills. Though her wrists still ached, she pushed herself up carefully. "I need to go outside," she said softly, not wanting to wake Mateo, who still slept by the cold stove. Colt looked up from where he sat mending a bridle. "You should rest more." "Please," Isabel insisted, already standing though her legs trembled. "I can't bear to be confined anymore." Understanding flickered across Colt's weathered face. He set aside his work and moved to her side, offering his arm for support. Together they made their way to the door, Isabel's steps growing steadier with each moment. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the sweet scent of late summer grass. Mateo had woken and darted past them, his previous day's weakness forgotten, as he chased grasshoppers through the tall grass. His laughter rang out, pure and bright, as the insects sprang away from his reaching hands. "He heals quick," Colt observed, helping Isabel settle onto a sun-warmed log near the cabin wall. "He's all I have left," Isabel said, watching her brother play. "Well, him and the deed." Colt's expression grew serious. "About that paper. If it's genuine, there's men who'd rather see it burn than let you claim what's rightfully yours. A spring's worth killing for in these parts." Isabel nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I know. That's why Father made me memorize every word before he died." "I need to ride into town," Colt said after a moment. "We're low on supplies, and those wrists need proper bandaging." The town square was busy when Colt rode in, his tall frame drawing stares from the boardwalk. Conversations died as he passed, replaced by cold whispers about his defiance of the mayor's justice. He tied his horse outside the general store, ducking his head to enter through the low doorway. Widow Harlow stood behind the counter, her grey hair neat beneath her cap. She watched Colt gather flour, coffee, and bandages, her eyes thoughtful. "Add these," she said quietly, slipping extra packets of dried meat and herbs onto his pile. When Colt reached for his money, she shook her head. "Not all of us approved of yesterday's display. That girl's father was a good man. Served with honor." "Much obliged, Mum," Colt said softly, tucking the supplies into his saddlebags. He had just mounted up when Deputy Crane stepped into the street, his badge glinting in the morning sun. The deputy's hand rested too casually near his gun belt. "Might want to reconsider your choices, Brennan," Crane called out, his voice carrying across the square. "Harboring thieves won't end well for you." Colt turned slowly in his saddle, looking down at the smaller man. Despite the threat, his voice remained steady and calm. "She's under my roof now. That makes her my responsibility." "Your funeral," Crane spat, but he didn't move as Colt rode past. The sun was high when Colt returned to find Isabel sitting with Mateo under the cottonwoods. An old prayer book lay open between them, its pages worn soft with age. Isabel's finger traced along the lines as Mateo carefully sounded out each word. "You can read?" Colt asked, surprised, as he unsaddled his horse. Isabel smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "The sisters at the mission school taught me. Father said—" Her voice caught for a moment. "He said education was a weapon that couldn't be stolen. He dreamed I'd use words to defend our people's rights, not guns like he had to." Colt nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. He began unpacking the supplies, setting aside the bandages for Isabel's wrists. "That deed needs to be registered proper," he said finally. "I can take it to the county clerk tomorrow. Won't be popular, but it's the right thing to do." "The mayor's men," Isabel started. "Let me worry about them." Colt interrupted gently. "Your father was right about one thing. Words on paper can be powerful weapons when used right." Isabel watched him a moment longer, then reached into her pocket where she'd kept the deed close. "Why are you helping us?" she asked softly. Colt's hand stilled as he considered her question. "Because someone needs to," he said finally. "And because it's what the good book teaches, to defend those who can't defend themselves." Mateo looked up from his letters, his young face serious. "Will we have to leave?" "No, little one," Isabel said firmly. "This is our home. Father earned it fair, and we're going to prove it." As evening approached, Colt rewrapped Isabel's wrists with the fresh bandages, his big hands gentle against her skin. "First light tomorrow," he said. "I'll take that deed to the county seat. It won't be easy, might stir up some hornets, but it's time to make things right." Isabel nodded, watching the sun sink behind the hills. The future was uncertain, but for the first time since her father's death, she felt hope stirring in her heart. Dawn painted the eastern sky in gentle brushstrokes of pink and gold as Colt hitched his team to the wagon. The old mules stomped their hooves against the dusty ground, their breath visible in the cool morning air. He'd lined the wagon bed with fresh straw and blankets, making it as comfortable as possible for his passengers. Isabel emerged from the cabin carrying Mateo, who was still drowsy with sleep. Her shawl was drawn tight against the morning chill as Colt helped them climb into the back. The boy curled up in the blankets while Isabel settled beside him, her hand protectively resting on his shoulder. 20 miles to the county seat," Colt said, checking the harnesses one final time. "Won't be the smoothest ride, but we'll make it before sunset." The wagon lurched forward, wheels creaking as they started down the rocky road. Dust rose in their wake, catching the early light like floating gold. The mules picked their way carefully over the uneven ground, each bump and dip sending jolts through the wooden frame. As morning stretched toward noon, Isabel broke the comfortable silence. "My father loved mornings like this," she said softly, watching the landscape roll past. "He said sunrise reminded him of God's promises, new every morning." Colt glanced back, his expression encouraging her to continue. He was different from what people expected of an Apache warrior. Isabel went on, absently stroking Mateo's hair as he dozed. "He chose to fight for the army, believing it would help our people. In New Mexico, he saved an officer's life during an ambush." Her voice grew distant with memory. "The officer had been separated from his unit. Father tracked him for 2 days, found him wounded in a ravine, carried him back to safety." Colt's hands tightened imperceptibly on the reins. Something about her story stirred an old discomfort in his chest, but he kept his face neutral. The sun climbed higher as they travelled, the wagon wheels jarring against stones and ruts. Isabel shared more stories of her father, his dreams for his children's education, his prayers for peace between peoples, his final days defending the spring that was rightfully theirs. Late afternoon shadows were stretching across the street when they finally rolled into the county seat. The courthouse stood proud among the other buildings, its clapboard walls weathered but maintained. Through its open windows came the busy sounds of clerks at work, shuffling papers, scratching pens, murmured conversations. Colt helped Isabel and Mateo down from the wagon, his large hands steady and gentle. Inside, the courthouse air was heavy with dust and the scent of old paper. The county registrar looked up from his desk, adjusting his spectacles as they approached. "May I help you?" he asked, his tone professional but not unkind. Isabel stepped forward, producing the carefully folded deed from her pocket. Her voice was clear and steady as she explained their purpose. The registrar accepted the document, spreading it carefully on his desk. His eyes moved methodically across the page, lingering on the army seal. "This appears to be in order," he murmured, then frowned slightly as he reached the bottom. "The authorizing signature here." He tapped the page with one finger. "Major Robert Brannan." Colt went absolutely still. Isabel, attuned to his presence behind her, noticed the change but didn't turn. "Is there a problem?" she asked the registrar. The clerk cleared his throat. No, the deed appears genuine. However, such claims must be properly verified at a hearing. We'll need to post notice and allow time for any challenges." He began writing in a thick ledger. "Return in 2 weeks' time." Relief and anxiety warred in Isabel's expression, but she nodded gracefully. "Thank you, sir." Outside, the sun was setting, painting the town in deep gold and purple shadows. Colt led them to a modest inn where clean rooms could be had for fair prices. He paid for their lodging without comment, his manner distracted. "I must take Mateo to evening prayer," Isabel said once they'd been shown their rooms. "There's a mission chapel just down the street. We saw it as we rode in." Colt nodded. "I'll walk with you." The chapel was small but welcoming, its windows glowing with candlelight. Isabel and Mateo slipped inside, making their way to a pew near the front. They knelt together, their heads bowed in prayer. The candlelight played across Isabel's face, highlighting the strength and grace in her features. Colt stood at the back, his tall frame shadowed by the doorway. He watched Isabel pray, saw how she drew Mateo close, teaching him the gestures of devotion with patient love. Something stirred in his heart, not just admiration for her resilience, but a deeper recognition of the faith that sustained her. All the while, his brother's signature on that deed burned in his thoughts like a brand. Robert, who had abandoned their family's ranch years ago, choosing army life over brotherhood. Robert, who had apparently saved Isabel's father's water rights, the same Robert who had once sworn he'd never help, their kind. The coincidence was too stark to ignore, but Colt kept his silence. Tonight, in this peaceful chapel, was not the time for such revelations. Instead, he watched the candlelight dance across the walls and listened to the soft murmur of prayers, letting the peace of the moment wash over him despite the turmoil in his heart. Morning light filtered through the inn's small window, catching dust motes in its pale beams. The dining room buzzed with travelers and townspeople breaking their fast, but Colt, Isabel, and Mateo sat quietly at a corner table. Their breakfast was modest, dry cornbread divided between them, with a small pat of butter stretched thin across the pieces. Mateo nibbled his portion carefully, trying to make it last. Isabel watched him with worried eyes, then glanced at Colt, who seemed lost in thought. His large frame made the wooden chair creak as he leaned forward, speaking low so only they could hear. "There's something you need to know about my brother Robert," he said, his voice rough with discomfort. "He's a stubborn man, set in his ways. Last I knew, he was deep in railroad business, their surveyor and land agent." Colt broke off a piece of cornbread but didn't eat it. He believes in progress at any cost. Ain't likely to stand against them, even if your claim is right. Isabel's fingers tightened around her tin cup. But his signature is on the deed. He gave his word to my father. Robert's word. Colt shook his head slowly. Well, it ain't worth much these days. Outside, dark clouds were gathering as they loaded the wagon for the return journey. The air felt heavy with coming rain, and thunder rolled in the distance. They'd barely covered 5 miles when the sky opened up, drenching them in seconds. The road turned treacherous, wagon wheels sliding in mud as Colt carefully guided the team forward. Isabel held Mateo close under a blanket, trying to shield him from the worst of the rain. The boy shivered against her, his cough returning in the damp air. Hours crawled by as they pushed onward, the mules trudging steadily through the muck. Lightning flashed across the hills, followed by booming thunder that made the team snort nervously. Dusk was falling when they finally spotted the silhouette of Colt's shack through the rain. All 3 were soaked to the bone, clothes heavy with water, as they stumbled inside. Colt immediately set to building up the fire while Isabel helped Mateo out of his wet things. A knock at the door startled them. Widow Harlow stood there, clutching a covered pot, her shawl drawn tight against the rain. "Thought you might be getting back about now," she said, stepping inside. Steam rose from the pot as she uncovered it, the rich smell of chicken soup filling the small space. "Made extra today. Seemed ashamed to waste it." Isabel's eyes welled with grateful tears as she accepted a bowl for Mateo. The widow bustled about, helping ladle out portions for everyone, her movements purposeful, but her voice careful and low. "Town's been talking," she said finally, glancing at the windows as if checking for listeners. "Mayor Granger's worried about something. Been in meetings with his business partners all day." She paused, stirring her soup. "He's got money tied up in land deals all through this territory, railroads promising him plenty more if he can deliver clear titles." The implications hung heavy in the air. Isabel's hand trembled slightly as she set down her spoon. After Widow Harlow left, they sat close to the fire, trying to drive the chill from their bones. Mateo curled up in a blanket near the hearth, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Colt reached for his Bible, worn leather smooth from years of handling, and began to read softly. "The Lord is my shepherd." His deep voice rumbled gentle in the firelit room. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." The familiar words washed over them like a balm. Mateo's breathing slowly evened out into sleep, his face peaceful in the dancing firelight. Isabel watched Colt as he read, noting how the flames cast shadows across his strong features, softening them. "I never thought—" she began quietly, then paused to gather her thoughts. "When I was young, at the mission school, I learned that white men saw my people as savages, less than human." Her fingers twisted in her skirt. "I believed all white men must hate us. But you—" She met his eyes across the fire. "You've shown such kindness, such mercy." Colt's hands tightened on the Bible, knuckles white with tension. Something dark flickered behind his eyes. Memories of violence, of choices that still haunted him. For a moment it seemed he might speak of them, might share that burden. Instead he swallowed hard and gently closed the Bible. "Ain't about color," he said finally, voice rough with emotion. "It's about what's right, what's true." Outside, a chorus of coyotes began their nightly song, their wild voices echoing off the hills. The sound carried through the walls of the little shack, a reminder of the untamed land beyond, of the dangers that lurked in darkness. Isabel drew her shawl closer, but found she wasn't afraid. Not here, not with Colt's solid presence nearby, his quiet strength a shield against whatever threats might come. The fire crackled low, casting long shadows as rain continued to drum against the roof. None of them spoke of the challenges ahead, the hearing, the mayor's schemes, the uncertain loyalty of Colt's brother. For now, it was enough to share this moment of peace, their trust in each other growing stronger than their fears. Morning sunlight warmed the packed dirt of Main Street as Isabel stepped onto the wooden sidewalk, her back straight despite lingering soreness. Colt walked beside her, his tall frame casting a protective shadow. His eyes scanned the street constantly, wary of trouble. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. Isabel adjusted her shawl, touching the small silver cross at her throat. "Yes, I do. Bitterness only breeds more hate." They made their way toward the white-painted church, where a bell tolled, calling folks to Sunday service. Mateo walked between them, his small hand in Isabel's, looking much better after several days of proper meals. Reverend Whitlock stood at the church steps, greeting his flock. His kind eyes brightened when he saw them approach. "Welcome, welcome," he said, reaching out to clasp Isabel's hand in both of his. "I've been praying for you, child." Inside, sunlight streamed through simple glass windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. Isabel felt stares as they took seats near the back, but she kept her eyes forward, focused on the wooden cross above the altar. The service proceeded as normal until the time for testimonies. Isabel rose slowly, her heart pounding. Colt tensed beside her, but she touched his shoulder gently before walking to the front. Facing the congregation, Isabel saw familiar faces, some who had jeered, others who had turned away. Her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger as she spoke. "I stand before you to offer forgiveness," she began. "For those who bound me to that cross, I forgive you. For those who mocked my heritage, I forgive you." She paused, meeting various eyes. "My father taught me that hate is a poison that kills the soul that carries it. I choose not to carry that burden." A heavy silence fell. Several women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Even some of the harder faces in the crowd softened, shame replacing judgment in their expressions. After the service, as people filed out, the blacksmith Jameson approached with his wife Naya. Jameson's leather apron was replaced by clean Sunday clothes, his huge hands scrubbed but still bearing the marks of his trade. Naya wore a dress that blended frontier and Comanche styles, her long black hair braided with careful dignity. "We'd be honored if you'd join us for supper," Naya said, her accent musical. "It's been too long since I shared a meal with someone who understands both worlds." Isabel glanced at Colt, who nodded. "We'd be much obliged," he answered for them. The blacksmith's home sat behind his shop, simple but well kept. Inside, savory smells filled the air as Naya stirred a pot of rabbit stew. Fresh bread cooled on the table, and wild flowers brightened the windowsill. As they ate, Naya shared stories of her early days in town, the sideways glances, the whispered words, the doors that closed in her face. "But Jameson never wavered," she said, looking at her husband with deep affection. "His love was stronger than their hate." Jameson reached for her hand. "Love's the only thing that ever changes hearts," he said simply. Isabel found herself relaxing as the evening wore on. When Naya described trying to learn proper table manners, while Jameson simultaneously learned Comanche customs, Isabel couldn't help laughing. A bright, clear sound that filled the room. Colt, watching her, felt something shift in his chest. He'd never seen her truly smile before, let alone laugh. The sun had set by the time they said their goodbyes. Oil lamps cast pools of yellow light along the boardwalk as they walked home, Mateo half asleep on Colt's shoulder. The night air carried the scent of sage and prairie grass. "Why do you live alone?" Isabel asked suddenly, her voice soft in the darkness. "A man like you, strong, kind, surely you could have had a family by now." Colt was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he spoke, his deep voice heavy with memory. "Years back, I worked a ranch in Texas, found the foreman beating a young Mexican boy who'd done nothing wrong." His jaw tightened. Something in me snapped. I beat that foreman so bad they thought he'd die. He didn't. But... Colt shook his head. "The rage I felt, it scared me more than anything. Made a vow right there. These hands would only ever be used to protect, never to harm out of anger." They stopped walking. Isabel turned to face him, her eyes bright in the lamplight. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out and placed her small hand over his large one. "That's not shame," she whispered. "That's honor. You chose mercy over vengeance, protection over power." Her fingers tightened on his. "That's the mark of a good man." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken things. Crickets chirped in the tall grass beyond the street, a peaceful chorus in the gathering night. Neither moved to break the connection, their joined hands a bridge between two worlds, finding common ground in the language of the heart. Mateo stirred on Colt's shoulder, murmuring sleepily in Spanish. The spell broke gently as Isabel drew back, though something had changed in the air between them, something as subtle and profound as the first warm breeze of spring after a long winter. The week unfolded like a gentle breeze across the prairie. Morning dew sparkled on tall grass as Isabel worked the small garden patch beside Colt's shack. Her hands, once bearing rope burns, now pressed seeds into dark soil with care and purpose. Mateo knelt beside her, his fever finally broken, carefully spacing the late summer bean plants. "Will they grow before winter, sister?" he asked, patting soil around a tender seedling. Isabel smiled, wiping sweat from her brow. "If we tend them well and pray for rain, little brother." Above them, hammer strikes rang out as Colt replaced worn shingles on the roof. His massive frame moved with surprising grace across the weathered planks. Every so often, he'd pause to watch Isabel and Mateo below, something warming in his chest at the sight of them bringing life to his lonely homestead. The peaceful rhythm of their days carried them through the week, but trouble lurked like storm clouds on the horizon. Whispers drifted in with town visitors, talk of land barons pressing the mare, of Isabel's deed threatening careful plans. Widow Harlow brought it up while delivering fresh bread, her voice low with concern. One sun-baked afternoon, hoofbeats approached the shack. Colt climbed down from the roof as Deputy Crane rode up, dust coating his horse's flanks. The deputy's badge glinted dully as he reined to a stop. "Brennan!" Crane called out, not dismounting. "Got a friendly word of advice." Colt stood his ground, positioned between the deputy and where Isabel worked in the garden. "Speak your piece." "Things are going to get rough." Crane's thin lips curved in an unfriendly smile. "Leave the half-breed and her brother behind, ain't your fight." "They're under my protection now." Colt's voice stayed level, but steel ran through it. "That makes it my fight. Your funeral." Crane wheeled his horse, spurring it harder than necessary. "Don't say you weren't warned." Isabel had risen from her gardening, standing straight despite the fear Colt could see in her eyes. She touched his arm gently. "You don't have to risk yourself for us." "Yes, I do." Colt covered her hand with his own. "Some things are worth standing for." Evening settled over the hills in shades of purple and gold. Cool air carried the scent of sage as Isabel sat with Mateo on the shack's small porch. Her voice lifted in a hymn learned years ago at the mission school, sweet and clear in the gathering dusk. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. That saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see." Colt leaned against the doorframe, watching shadows lengthen across the land. The hymn's familiar words touched something deep in his soul. Memories of his mother singing, of faith before violence scarred him. Mateo's small voice joined his sister's on the chorus, and for a moment the lonely shack felt like something else entirely. Like home. The next morning dawned bright as the town gathered for prayer meeting. Isabel wore her best dress, faded but clean, a silver cross at her throat catching sunlight. Inside the white-painted church, she rose to speak again, her voice steady and clear. "Water gives life," she said, meeting the eyes of those gathered. "The spring my father died protecting isn't just for one people, but for all. God's bounty wasn't meant for walls and fences, but for sharing. We can choose unity over division, mercy over greed." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the congregation. Naya, the blacksmith's Comanche wife, nodded firmly. Widow Harlow dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Even some of the harder faces had softened, seeing not a half-breed girl, but a woman of faith and courage. After the service, several townspeople approached to shake Isabel's hand. The cooper's wife offered preserved peaches. The schoolmaster asked if Matteo might join lessons when term began. Hope bloomed like desert flowers after rain. Walking home, Colt found himself imagining possibilities he'd long denied. A real home, not just a shack. A family to fill it with warmth and song. The weight of old guilt lifting like morning mist. But as they approached the shack, his trained eye caught signs that stilled such dreams. Fresh hoof prints circled the building. Several horses, their riders having watched from the shadows. A warning, clear as tracks in snow. Isabel's enemies were marking their target. Colt said nothing to worry Isabel and Matteo, but his jaw tightened as he studied the tracks. These weren't town horses. The prints showed shoes typical of drifters, hired guns who did others' dirty work. His hand brushed the worn handle of his Colt revolver, and he offered a quiet prayer of his own. That night, he added extra logs to the fire, its light pushing back the darkness. Isabel sat mending Matteo's shirt while the boy slept, her needle flashing in the firelight. Looking at them, Colt felt his protective instincts sharpen like a blade against stone. Whatever came, he would keep them safe. The oil lamp cast soft shadows across the shack's worn floorboards as Isabel sat mending a tear in Matteo's shirt. The boy slept peacefully on the narrow bed, his breathing steady and clear for the first time in weeks. Colt settled in his chair by the fire, his Bible open on his knee, though his eyes kept drifting to Isabel's graceful movements with needle and thread. Peace filled the small space until sudden thundering hoofbeats shattered the quiet night. Before either could move, sharp cracks split the air. Bullets punched through the thin wooden walls, sending splinters flying. "Down!" Colt lunged forward, covering Isabel with his massive frame as more shots peppered the shack. She clutched at his shirt, trembling but silent. The lamp tumbled, plunging them into darkness broken only by muzzle flashes through the windows. Matteo woke with a cry of terror. "Sister! Stay down, boy!" Colt commanded, his voice steady despite the chaos. He could hear horses circling, their riders whooping and cursing. More shots cracked, one bullet whistling so close he felt its passage. Isabel tried to rise. "Matteo, I've got him." Colt crawled to the bed, dragging Matteo to the floor beside them. He wrapped both arms around Isabel and her brother as lead continued to tear through the walls. Then, as suddenly as it began, the attack ended. Hoofbeats thundered away into the night, leaving only the sound of their ragged breathing and the crackle of dying embers in the hearth. Long moments passed before Colt eased his protective hold. "Stay down," he whispered, fumbling for matches. The lamp had spilled, but not broken. Its weak light revealed Isabel holding Matteo close, her face pale but composed. "Are you hurt?" Colt asked, checking them both carefully. Isabel shook her head. "We're whole, by God's mercy." Dawn painted the hills gold as Colt inspected the damage. Bullet holes riddled the shack's walls. He counted 15 shots at least. His jaw tightened at the sight. These weren't warning shots fired wild. The attackers had aimed to kill. Isabel joined him outside, Matteo clinging to her skirts. "They meant to provoke you into fighting back," she said softly. "I know." Colt's massive hands clenched. The urge to hunt down the riders burned in his chest, but he forced it down. "I made a vow. No more killing. But I won't stand idle while they threaten innocent lives." He saddled his horse, checking his gun belt more from habit than intent. "I'm riding to town. Mayor Granger needs to understand this won't be settled with bullets." "Be careful." Isabel touched his arm. Men like him fear truth more than violence. The morning bustle of town fell quiet as Colt rode down the main street. Folks ducked into doorways or turned aside, avoiding his gaze. He dismounted at the mayor's office, his spurs ringing on the wooden sidewalk. Mayor Granger sat behind his desk, a false smile spreading across his fleshy face. "Why, Mr. Brannan? What brings you to town so early?" "You know why." Colt planted both hands on the desk, looming over the smaller man. "Armed riders shot up my place last night. Could have killed the girl and her brother." Terrible business. Granger's smile never wavered. Lots of rough sorts passing through lately, hard to keep track. "This stops now." Colt's voice remained level, but steel ran through it. "Before someone dies." "Threats, Mr. Brannan?" The mayor's eyes went cold. "That's not very Christian of you." "Not a threat, a fact." Colt straightened to his full height. "The deed hearing happens clean, or the territory marshal learns about certain land deals that don't quite add up." Something flickered in Granger's expression. Fear quickly masked. "Good day, Mr. Brannan." The sun hung low when Colt returned to find Jameson's wagon outside the shack. The blacksmith and his wife Nea had brought tools and lumber, already at work patching bullet holes. "Neighbors help neighbors," Jameson said simply, driving another nail home. Naya worked alongside her husband, her movements sure and practiced. "My people say a home attacked grows stronger when friends rebuild it," she told Isabel in her quiet way. They gathered around the fire that evening, sharing a simple meal of beans and cornbread. Mateo sat close to Isabel, still shaken but drawing comfort from the circle of adults. "When we married," Jameson said, his arm around Naya's shoulders, "half the town wanted us gone. Said it wasn't natural, wasn't right. But we stood our ground." Naya nodded. "Each day we stayed made the next day easier. Now those same people greet us in the street, trade at the forge." "How did you find the courage?" Isabel asked. "By remembering we weren't alone." Naya's dark eyes held wisdom earned through trial. "Creator sends help in many forms, sometimes as friends who bring hammers and nails." Colt watched Isabel absorb these words, saw strength returning to her spine. The attack had shaken her, but here was proof that standing firm against injustice could bear fruit. His own heart lifted, recognizing that his solitary path had led him to this moment, not just protecting Isabel and Mateo, but finding fellowship in the struggle. The repaired walls stood solid in the firelight. Where bullet holes had threatened to destroy, friendship had made the shack stronger. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they sat together, bound by something deeper than fear. The late September wind rustled through dying leaves as Colt guided his horse toward the mission station. Dust swirled around his boots when he dismounted, the telegraph office's weathered sign creaking above. Inside, the operator's pencil scratched against paper as Colt dictated his message. "To Major Robert Brannan, Fort Collins. Your presence required. Land deed hearing. Your signature questioned. Come at once. C. Brannan." Each word cost precious cents, but Colt counted out the coins without hesitation. The operator's eyebrows rose at the name, but he kept his peace, tapping out the message in sharp clicks. Back at the shack, Isabel watched him return, her dark eyes questioning. "Will he come?" "He'll come." Colt's voice held certainty, though his jaw tightened. Robert always did love an audience. Days crept past like molasses. Isabel spent hours teaching Mateo his letters, her quiet voice steady despite the fear Colt saw in her shoulders. When word finally arrived, "Arriving Thursday, stop. Major R. Brannan." Isabel's hands trembled as she folded the telegram. "Your brother," she whispered. "He has power with the army, with the railroad. What if—" "Trust in truth," Colt said, though his own heart hammered. "Trust in God." Thursday dawned clear and cold. The courthouse square filled early, townsfolk gathering to whisper and watch. Isabel knelt in prayer before they left the shack, Mateo's small hand in hers. Colt waited silently, his Sunday best coat tight across his broad shoulders. They walked together down the dusty street, Isabel's spine straight despite her worn dress. Mateo clung to Colt's massive hand, his eyes wide at the crowd. Widow Harlow nodded as they passed. Jameson and Naya stood quietly near the courthouse steps, offering silent support. The courtroom smelled of pine wood and dust. Mayor Granger sat near the front, his lawyer shuffling papers importantly. The judge, a grey-haired man named Patterson, adjusted his spectacles at the bench. Then boot heels rang on wooden floors. Major Robert Brannan entered, his blue uniform immaculate, cavalry sword at his hip. The brothers hadn't seen each other in 5 years, but time hadn't softened their differences. Where Colt was a giant made gentle by conscience, Robert was tall and rigid with pride. Their eyes met across the room. Recognition flared, then hardened into distance. Isabel felt Colt's muscles tense beside her. The crowd held its breath, watching the silent battle of wills between brothers. "All rise!" the bailiff called. Judge Patterson gavelled for order. The mayor's lawyer rose first, his voice oily. "Your Honor, we contend this supposed deed is clearly fraudulent. The signature purports to be Major Brannan's, yet the signature is genuine." Robert interrupted, his voice crisp. "I signed it myself." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The lawyer sputtered. "But, sir, surely you wouldn't grant valuable water rights to—" "I ask to speak." Isabel stood, her voice quiet but clear. Judge Patterson nodded, peering at her over his glasses. "My father was Captain Miguel Ortega," she began. "He served with honor in the New Mexico campaigns. He saved lives, including yours, Major Brannan." Robert's face remained stone, but his hand tightened on his sword hilt. "Papa believed in justice," Isabel continued. "He died defending our spring because he knew water means life in this land. He trusted the Army's word, trusted that deed would protect his children's future." Her voice caught. He died believing in that promise. "A touching tale," Robert said coldly. "But sentiment doesn't establish legal right." Colt surged to his feet, his face dark with anger. But Isabel's small hand found his, squeezing gently. He subsided, though his eyes blazed at his brother. "Your Honor," the mayor's lawyer jumped in. "Regardless of sentiment, there are proper channels. These people can't simply—" "These people," Colt's deep voice cut through the room, "have shown more honor than some who wear uniforms." He stared at Robert. "You know the truth, brother. You were there when Captain Ortega took that bullet meant for you. You signed that deed in gratitude and shame." The courtroom fell silent. Robert's face worked with emotion he fought to master. Judge Patterson cleared his throat. "Given the complexity of these claims, I'll need time to review all evidence. This hearing will reconvene in 1 week." His gavel cracked like a gunshot. The crowd began to disperse, muttering. Robert turned on his heel, but Colt's voice stopped him. "Still running, Robert." The major paused, then spoke without turning. "Some things are better left buried, brother. Like truth, like honor." Colt's words carried clearly. "Papa taught us better than that." Robert's shoulders stiffened, but he marched out without reply. Isabel touched Colt's arm gently. "Your brother fears something," she said softly. "Aye." Colt watched the doorway where Robert had vanished. "And we need to learn what it is before next week's hearing." They walked home through lengthening shadows, Mateo between them. The boy's small voice broke their troubled thoughts. "Will we lose our spring?" Isabel knelt, drawing him close. "No, mi pequeño. God sees truth, even when men try to hide it." Colt looked down at them, this small family he'd sworn to protect. Something more than duty stirred in his heart, something that felt like belonging. Whatever secrets his brother held, whatever power the mayor wielded, he would not let them stand against that truth. Rain drummed against the shack's tin roof as Colt and Isabel trudged inside, their boots heavy with mud from the courthouse walk. Mateo huddled near the fireplace while Isabel kindled fresh flames, her hands trembling slightly from the day's strain. The hearth's warmth barely pushed back the dampness seeping through weathered walls. Colt hung his damp coat by the door, his shoulders bent with more than physical weariness. The sight of his brother had torn open old wounds he'd thought long healed. He sank into his rough-hewn chair, staring into the growing flames. Isabel wrapped a blanket around Mateo's shoulders before settling on the floor near Colt's feet. "Something haunts you," she said softly. "I saw it in your eyes when he entered." Thunder rolled distant in the hills. Colt's fingers traced the scar along his jaw, a mark usually hidden by his beard. "Robert wasn't always cold," he began, his deep voice barely above a whisper. "We worked our father's ranch together after he passed, built it up from nearly nothing." He paused, watching sparks rise up the chimney. Then came the drought year, cattle dying, ranch hands desperate, some turned to rustling. His jaw tightened. "I caught them at it. They jumped me, 6 against 1. I called for Robert. He was just beyond the ridge. Had to have heard." Isabel's hand found his, her fingers warm against his calloused palm. "He didn't come." "Watched from above. Later said he couldn't risk getting involved. Claimed he was protecting the ranch's reputation." Colt's voice grew hoarse. "They beat me half to death. Left me scarred inside and out. When I recovered, I sold my share and rode away. Haven't spoken to him since, till today." "Madre de Dios," Isabel whispered. She rose to her knees, taking both his hands in hers. "Lord, hear our prayer," she began, her voice clear and strong despite the storm's growl. "Heal these brothers' hearts. Let truth bridge the gap between them. Show them the path to forgiveness." Colt's chest tightened at her simple faith. "Isabel," he interrupted roughly, "after seeing what was done to you, to Mateo, I fear becoming like those men. The anger in me, sometimes it rises up like a tide." She met his troubled gaze. "You're already different," she said firmly. "When you found us at that cross, you didn't strike anyone. You chose mercy. That's who you truly are." Before Colt could respond, a harsh cough shattered the moment. Mateo doubled over, his thin frame racked with spasms. Isabel rushed to him, pressing her hand to his forehead. "He's burning up." The fear in her voice cut straight to Colt's heart. She pulled the blanket tighter around the boy, but his coughing only worsened. "Something's wrong with his breathing." Colt was already pulling his coat back on. "I'm getting Doc Miller." "But the storm won't stop me." He paused at the door, meeting her frightened eyes. "Trust me." The rain hit him like icy needles as he mounted his horse. Lightning split the sky, but Colt spurred forward, letting the animal pick its way through mud and standing water. The town's streets were deserted, shutters battened against the weather. He pounded on the doctor's door until lights flickered inside. Doc Miller, a gruff man with kind eyes, didn't waste time with questions. He threw on his oilskin coat and grabbed his bag, following Colt into the downpour. They reached the shack past midnight, their horses lathered and blowing. Inside, Isabel knelt beside Mateo's bed, praying in whispered Spanish. The boy's breathing came in wheezes, his face flushed with fever. The doctor examined him thoroughly, pressing an ear to his chest, frowning at what he heard. "Smoke damage to the lungs," he announced grimly. "From when those cowards shot up your place. The dampness tonight brought it to crisis." He dug through his bag, pulling out bottles and powders. "We need to ease his breathing, break the fever." Isabel clutched Colt's hand as the doctor worked, her fingers ice-cold with fear. Colt stood like a mountain beside her, lending what strength he could. Through the long hours, they took turns helping Mateo sit up to drink the doctor's medicines, bathing his hot face with cool cloths, listening to his labored breaths. Near dawn, the storm began to ease. Mateo's fever still raged, but his coughing grew less violent. Doc Miller dozed in Colt's chair while Isabel sang soft lullabies to her brother, her voice rough with exhaustion. Colt hadn't moved from her side, his large hand steady on her shoulder. "I can't lose him," she whispered, so quietly only Colt could hear. "He's all I have left of Papa." "You have more than that now," Colt answered, his voice gentle as summer rain. "You have friends in town, you have—" He hesitated. "You have me." She leaned against him then, letting his strength hold her up as first light crept through the window. Together they watched Mateo's chest rise and fall, each breath a quiet battle, each moment a prayer for morning. Outside, the storm had washed the world clean. But inside the shack, the night's vigil continued, binding 3 hearts closer with each passing hour. The first rays of dawn crept through the shack's weathered windows, casting pale light on Mateo's sleeping face. His breathing had finally eased, the harsh rattle softening to gentle rhythms. Dr. Miller checked the boy's forehead one last time, nodding with satisfaction. "The fever's broken," he said quietly, packing his medical bag. "Keep him warm and quiet today. Give him the willow bark tea every few hours." Isabel sagged with relief, her shoulders dropping as tension fled. Dark circles shadowed her eyes from the sleepless night, but joy brightened her weary face. She touched Mateo's cheek softly, careful not to wake him. "Thank you," she whispered to the doctor, "for coming through the storm." Miller shook his head. "Thank Brannan here. Not many would have ridden out in that weather." He tipped his hat and slipped out into the misty morning. Colt stood by the window, his own exhaustion evident in the slump of his broad shoulders. He'd kept vigil all night, a steady presence through each frightening hour. Now he watched Isabel tend to her sleeping brother, his heart full of feelings he dared not name. Isabel rose slowly, her skirts rustling as she crossed to where he stood. Tears shimmered in her dark eyes, catching the morning light. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything you've done for us." "No thanks needed," Colt replied softly. "When I was a girl," Isabel continued, gazing out at the dawn-touched hills, "I used to pray every night. I'd beg God to send someone to protect what was left of my family." She turned to him, tears spilling down her cheeks. Someone strong enough to stand against the whole world if needed, but gentle enough to understand our hearts. Colt's throat tightened. He looked down at her upturned face, seeing trust and something deeper in her eyes. "Maybe he sent you someone," he said quietly. Isabel's breath caught. For a long moment they stood in silence, the morning light wrapping around them like a blessing. Something shifted between them, deep and permanent as the mountains on the horizon. The moment broke at the sound of approaching footsteps. Widow Harlow appeared at the door, her grey hair escaping its pins, excitement lighting her weathered face. "Isabel! Colt!" she called, hurrying inside. "The most extraordinary thing has happened." She paused, catching her breath. "Reverend Whitlock was going through his old papers last night during the storm. He found something, a journal from his chaplain days. He says it mentions your father, Isabel." Isabel's hand flew to her throat. "My father?" "Yes. The Reverend wants to see you both right away. He says it might help with the hearing." Colt and Isabel exchanged quick glances. "Mateo," Isabel began. "I'll stay with the boy," Widow Harlow offered. "This can't wait." Minutes later, Colt and Isabel hurried through the morning mist toward the small parsonage behind the church. Isabel's skirts brushed the wet grass, her steps quick with urgency. Reverend Whitlock met them at the door, his kind face animated with purpose. Come in," he urged, leading them to his study. Books and papers covered every surface, and a leather-bound journal lay open on his desk. "I couldn't sleep during the storm, so I was sorting old papers. When I found this," he lifted the journal reverently, "I kept detailed accounts during my time as an army chaplain. And here, look." He opened to a page marked with a faded ribbon. The ink had browned with age, but the writing remained clear. Isabel leaned forward, her hands trembling slightly as she read. "April 15th, 1867. Whitlock read aloud. "Today witnessed an act of tremendous courage. Captain Miguel Ortega, our Apache scout, saved Major Brannan's life during an ambush near the Pecos River. The Major's horse was shot, pinning him as hostiles approached. Captain Ortega, despite being wounded himself, fought his way to Brannan's side. He held off the attackers single-handedly until help arrived, then collapsed from blood loss. The Major swore a debt of honor to him. I write this to remember such brotherhood knows no boundaries of race or rank. Isabel pressed her hands to her mouth, tears flowing freely now. Papa never spoke of this. He was so humble about his service. Colt stood very still, his jaw tight with emotion. Robert never mentioned it either, but this explains why he signed the deed. There's more, Whitlock said, turning the page. Major Brannan insisted on nursing Ortega himself during his recovery. They spoke often of their hopes for peace between peoples. Ortega described the spring lands where his family lived, how he dreamed of his children growing up there in harmony with all neighbors. Brannan promised to help make that dream real someday. The deed wasn't just payment of a debt, Isabel whispered. It was a promise between friends. Colt took her hand, his large fingers enfolding hers. This changes everything. Robert can't deny his own words, witnessed and recorded by a chaplain. Reverend Whitlock closed the journal carefully. I'll testify to its authenticity at the hearing. These words were written with no thought they'd ever be needed, which makes them all the more powerful now. Hope blazed in Isabel's eyes as she looked up at Colt. He squeezed her hand gently, his own heart lifting. Here at last was proof that could pierce through lies and greed, that could remind his brother of a better self, long buried. Your father's courage saved my brother's life, Colt said softly. Now his honor might save your future. Isabel's fingers tightened around his. Together they stood in the morning light streaming through the parsonage windows, holding on to each other, and this new dawn of possibility. Morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the packed wooden benches. Townsfolk pressed shoulder to shoulder, their hushed whispers filling the air like rustling leaves. News of Reverend Whitlock's journal had spread through town like wildfire, drawing curious faces from every corner of the settlement. Isabel smoothed her best dress with trembling fingers as she sat between Colt and Mateo in the front row. The boy fidgeted, still pale from his illness but determined to be present. Reverend Whitlock sat just behind them, the leather-bound journal resting in his lap like precious cargo. Judge Harrison entered, his black robes sweeping as he took his place at the bench. The room fell silent, save for the creak of wooden floors and the distant whistle of a passing train. This hearing will come to order, the judge announced, his voice carrying to the rafters. We're here to make final determination on the deed claim of Isabel Ortega regarding the spring lands west of town. Mayor Granger sat with his lawyer, both men looking smug despite the morning's tension. At a separate table, Major Robert Brannan's military posture remained rigid, though his eyes darted occasionally toward his brother. Major Brannan, Judge Harrison called, please step forward once more. The major rose, his boot heels clicking against the floorboards as he approached the bench. Sunlight glinted off his brass buttons, but something in his bearing had changed since the previous hearing, a slight stoop to his shoulders, a tension around his mouth. Your Honor, he said, clearing his throat. Before you speak, Major, I understand Reverend Whitlock has pertinent testimony. The judge gestured to the preacher. Please approach, Reverend. Whitlock walked forward slowly, the journal cradled in his weathered hands. He opened it to the marked page, the paper crackling softly in the hushed room. Your Honor, with permission, I'll read from my wartime journal, dated April 15th, 1867. At the judge's nod, Whitlock's clear voice filled the courthouse. Today witnessed an act of tremendous courage. Captain Miguel Ortega, our Apache scout, saved Major Brannan's life during an ambush near the Pecos River. The major's horse was shot, pinning him as hostiles approached. Major Brannan's face flushed dark red. His hands clenched behind his back as Whitlock continued. Captain Ortega, despite being wounded himself, fought his way to Brannan's side. He held off the attackers single-handedly until help arrived, then collapsed from blood loss. The major swore a debt of honor to him. Murmurs rippled through the courthouse. Isabel watched tears gather in Mateo's eyes at this account of their father's bravery. Colt sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed on his brother's face. Major Brannan, the judge said quietly, do you dispute this account? Robert Brannan's military bearing crumpled slightly. "No, Your Honor," he said, his voice rough. "I cannot dispute it. Every word is true." "And the deed in question, did you sign it freely in recognition of this debt?" The Major's shoulders sagged. "I did, Your Honor. Captain Ortega." He paused, swallowing hard. "He didn't just save my life. He stayed with me through the night, stemming my wounds, speaking of his hopes for peace between our peoples. He spoke of the spring lands, of his children growing up there." His eyes flickered to Isabel. "I promised to help make that dream real." Gasps and whispers filled the room. Mayor Granger leaped to his feet, his face mottled with anger. "Your Honor, this is mere sentiment. The railroad's interests—" "Silence!" Judge Harrison's gavel cracked like thunder. "The railroad's interests do not supersede legally filed deeds or sworn testimony." He turned back to the Major. "Continue, sir." "The deed was filed honestly," Robert said, each word seeming to cost him. "It was my way of repaying a debt of honor to a brave man. I've forgotten that honor lately, but—" He turned to face his brother and Isabel directly. "I cannot deny it any longer." Colt's jaw clenched tight as he met his brother's gaze. Years of bitterness hung between them, but something else flickered there too, a memory of brotherhood, of better days. Isabel clasped Mateo's hand tightly, her lips moving in silent prayer. Around them, townspeople shifted in their seats, many looking down in shame as they remembered their treatment of the Ortega children. Judge Harrison surveyed the room slowly before speaking. "Having heard all testimony and examined the evidence, I find the deed presented by Isabel Ortega to be valid and binding." His gavel struck once more. "The Springlands are hereby confirmed as the legal property of the Ortega family. This hearing is concluded." The courtroom erupted in a mixture of reactions, relief, surprise, even scattered applause. Mateo threw his arms around his sister, who held him close as tears streamed down her face. Reverend Whitlock clasped her shoulder gently, his own eyes bright with emotion. Colt stood slowly, his massive frame drawing attention as he approached his brother. For a long moment, the two men faced each other in silence while the room watched, holding its breath. "Thank you," Colt said simply, "for telling the truth." Robert nodded stiffly, military bearing warring with deeper feelings. "Your Miss Ortega's father was a better man than most. Perhaps," he hesitated, "perhaps it's time I remembered that about more than just him." Understanding passed between the brothers, not forgiveness yet, but a first step toward it. Isabel joined them, her face glowing with quiet joy. "Major Brannan," she said softly, "my father would be proud to see his faith in you proven right today." The Major bowed slightly, then turned and walked from the courthouse, his footsteps fading into the morning beyond. Around them, townsfolk began to disperse, many stopping to offer quiet congratulations to Isabel or shake Colt's hand. Mateo tugged at his sister's skirt. "Does this mean we can stay? For true?" Isabel gathered him close, sharing a warm glance with Colt over the boy's head. "Yes, mi hermano. We can stay. God has answered our prayers at last." The courthouse fell silent as Isabel rose slowly from her seat, her simple dress catching the morning light. All eyes turned to her as she stepped forward, her voice clear yet gentle in the hushed room. "Your Honor, if I may speak?" Judge Harrison nodded, curiosity crossing his weathered features. "Of course, Miss Ortega." Isabel squared her shoulders, drawing strength from Colt's steady presence behind her. "I am grateful for this ruling, more than words can say. But I have been thinking much about water, about thirst." She gestured to the gathered townsfolk. "About how every living soul needs it, just as we all need God's mercy." Whispers rustled through the courthouse as she continued. "My father believed the spring was God's gift, not meant for one family alone. So I ask the court to record my wish. Let the spring be held in trust for all who thirst, townspeople, travelers, cattle, everyone." Gasps echoed off the wooden walls. Mayor Granger's mouth fell open in shock. Even Colt straightened in surprise, though pride soon warmed his features. "You would share these rights you fought so hard to win?" Judge Harrison asked, leaning forward. Isabel nodded. "Water gives life. How can I claim God's blessing for myself alone?" Her voice softened. "There has been enough division. Let the spring bring us together instead." The judge removed his spectacles, visibly moved. "Miss Ortega, your generosity humbles this court. Let the record show that the spring rights are to be held in public trust, as requested." His gavel fell gently. "So ordered." Throughout the afternoon, word of Isabel's decision spread through town like a cleansing rain. As evening approached, lanterns began to glow outside the white-painted church. Townsfolk gathered, their faces softened in the warm light as Reverend Whitlock led them in prayer. One by one, people rose to speak. The blacksmith's wife dabbed tears as she apologized for turning away when Isabel was tied to the cross. Deputy Crane removed his hat, shame coloring his face as he asked forgiveness for his cruelty. Even the mayor's wife stood, admitting she had let fear rule over Christian charity. Isabel accepted each apology with grace, her hand often finding Colt's for strength. Mateo sat beside them, his eyes wide at seeing so many proud folks humble themselves. After the last confession, Reverend Whitlock led them in a hymn of thanksgiving. Isabel's clear voice rose with the others, singing of God's mercy as crickets chirped in the darkness beyond the lantern light. As the final notes faded, Colt squeezed Isabel's hand once, then released it. She turned, puzzled, as he stepped into the open space before the church steps. The lamplight caught his face, usually so guarded, now open with emotion. "Isabel," he said, his deep voice carrying easily to the crowd. "When I first saw you bound to that cross, something in my heart broke free." He slowly lowered himself to one knee, drawing gasps from the gathered townspeople. "I cut those ropes because I couldn't bear to see you bound, but since that day you've been the one setting me free, from loneliness, from bitterness, from fear." Isabel's hands flew to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. Mateo bounced on his toes, grinning broadly. "I'm just a rough man who's made his share of mistakes," Colt continued, his voice growing husky. "But if you'll have me, I vow to spend every day trying to deserve you." He reached for her trembling hands. "I cut you free once. Let me cut you free every day for the rest of my life. Will you marry me, Isabel Ortega?" For a moment, only the sound of crickets filled the night. Then Isabel's voice, thick with tears but firm with certainty. "Yes. Oh yes, mi amor." Joy broke across Colt's face as he stood, gathering her into his arms. The townspeople erupted in cheers and applause. Mateo launched himself at them both, laughing as Colt swept him up too. At the edge of the crowd, Major Robert Brannan watched silently. The lantern light revealed something softer in his stern features. Regret, yes, but also a glimmer of hope. His brother had found what he himself had lost long ago, the courage to choose love over pride. Widow Harlow began organizing an impromptu celebration. Naya and her husband brought out fiddles, while others ran home for food and drink. Soon the churchyard filled with music and laughter. Isabel and Colt hardly noticed, lost in each other's eyes as Mateo danced around them. The boy's fever-worn face glowed with happiness, secure at last in the promise of family, home, and love that would never again be bound by ropes of fear or hate. The lanterns burned bright against the darkening sky, their light catching the tears of joy that fell unashamedly from Isabel's eyes. Not tears of humiliation now, but of triumph, forgiveness, and the sweet certainty of belonging. Golden leaves drifted on the breeze as October painted the Colorado hills in amber and rust. The cottonwoods along the creek blazed with autumn glory, their branches swaying gently against the crystal blue sky. At the newly dug community well near the spring, a small crowd gathered in the crisp morning air. Sarah Running Deer drew water alongside Widow Harlow, their buckets splashing in comfortable friendship. A group of ranch hands waited their turn, exchanging easy greetings with a family of Apache travelers who had stopped to refresh their horses. The clear water flowed freely, just as Isabel had wished, a blessing for all who thirsted. The town had changed in these few weeks. Where suspicion once drew hard lines between peoples, now simple courtesies bloomed like late wildflowers. Children played together near the well, their laughter carrying no trace of the old prejudices. By mid-morning, the little white church filled to bursting. Townsfolk squeezed into rough-hewn pews, their Sunday best brightened with ribbons and flowers for the occasion. Mateo, scrubbed clean and wearing a new shirt sewn by Widow Harlow, could hardly contain his excitement as he waited by the church door. When Isabel appeared, a collective sigh rose from the gathering. She wore a simple cream-colored dress, but her radiance outshone any fancy garment. In her dark hair she had woven small white blossoms, the same kind that grew near the spring. Her eyes sparkled with joyful tears as she took Mateo's offered arm. "Ready, hermana?" he whispered, standing as tall as his 10 years would allow. Isabel squeezed his hand. "Ready, mi pequeño." The congregation rose as brother and sister started down the aisle. Near the front, Naya dabbed her eyes while her husband, the blacksmith, smiled broadly. The schoolteacher who had once turned Isabel away now beamed with genuine warmth. Deputy Crane stood respectfully, his badge gleaming against a fresh-pressed shirt. At the altar, Colt waited, looking almost boyish despite his imposing height. He had traded his work clothes for a clean black suit, though his boots still bore honest scuffs from ranch work. When he saw Isabel, his face transformed with wonder. Reverend Whitlock opened his worn Bible, his kind eyes crinkling as he began the service. "Dearly beloved," his voice carried clear and strong, "we gather today to celebrate not just the union of two hearts, but the binding together of all God's children in love and mercy." Sunlight streamed through the windows as the preacher spoke of freedom. Freedom from fear, from hatred, from the chains that human hearts forge against one another. His words touched every soul present, reminding them of their own journey from darkness to light. "Just as Christ breaks every bond," he continued, "so too must we free each other daily through love and understanding." Isabel and Colt exchanged simple rings, their voices steady with conviction as they spoke their vows. Mateo stood proudly between them, no longer the frightened, fever-racked boy of months past. When Reverend Whitlock pronounced them husband and wife, the boy's whoop of joy set off delighted laughter through the church. Outside, tables groaned with food brought by every family in town. Pies cooled beside Mexican tamales and Apache fry bread. Children darted between adults' legs as fiddle music filled the autumn air. Isabel and Colt moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and sharing their joy. Near the edge of the gathering, Major Robert Brannan stood quietly. He had left his uniform behind, wearing instead a plain dark suit that somehow softened his military bearing. When Isabel approached, he bowed slightly. "Miss Ortega, Mrs. Brannan now," he corrected himself. "Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished here." Isabel studied him for a moment, then smiled gently. "There is room at our table, Major, if you would join us." The older Brannan hesitated, his eyes finding his brother's. Colt stood straight but didn't turn away. Finally, Robert nodded. "I would be honored." As afternoon mellowed toward evening, lanterns began to glow in the deepening shadows. Couples danced while others sang hymns and traditional songs, voices blending in harmony. The territorial governor's telegram of congratulations was read aloud, praising the town's example of peaceful resolution. When the sun painted the western sky in brilliant orange and pink, Colt led his tall bay horse forward. He had packed saddlebags for their journey to the honeymoon cabin, borrowed from Jameson's cousin up in the hills. With easy strength, he lifted Isabel onto the horse's back, her cream dress settling around her like a cloud. Then he reached down for Mateo, swinging the boy up to sit securely in front of his sister. The three of them together, at last a true family, made a picture that brought fresh tears to many eyes. Isabel leaned close to Colt's ear as he mounted behind them. "Once they tied me to a cross," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But God cut me free through you." Colt caught her hand, pressing it to his lips. "Through him, through us all," he replied softly. They turned their horse toward the sunset, but not before waving farewell to the gathered townspeople. The crowd cheered and called blessings after them as they rode away. Behind them, the town hummed with new life and purpose. Music and laughter drifted on the evening breeze. Near the spring, the new well stood as a testament to what could happen when hearts opened and old wounds healed. Children played tag in the twilight, their calls carrying no trace of which family or background they came from. Major Brannan watched his brother's family disappear into the golden light. Something eased in his rigid posture as Reverend Whitlock came to stand beside him. "Quite a change from when you first arrived," the preacher observed quietly. "Yes," Robert agreed, a hint of wonder in his voice. "Quite a change indeed." The autumn sun sank lower, setting the cottonwoods ablaze one final time. As darkness gathered, the lanterns burned brighter, like stars brought down to earth, each one a beacon of the hope that had taken root in this once divided town, promising light for all the days to come. Thanks for being here. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a truth, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another moment that just might speak to your soul.